Dean O, colleagues, it's a great pleasure for me to be here. I have come to Korea University so frequently. When I go to some of the other universities, they complain that I favor Korea University more than other universities. It's largely because you have some really exciting programs. I have participated in your Model UN, Model UNFCCC, and Northeast Asia specific programs. But this is the first time I'm here speaking to the graduate students specifically. In all the other times, there were Korea University students, but also a number of other students and faculty. Let me dive right into the topic for discussion today. I thought I shouldn't just leave the title 2015 without a subheading. But then all the subheadings that I thought of didn't really come together very nicely. So I thought I would begin the lecture with 2015 and start asking a series of questions on what 2015 could possibly mean to you. The first, of course, is there it is. It's very clear to you. It is 2015 AD. You could, of course, also think about this as the 15th year of the third millennium and 15th year of the 21st century. But that is really going by the calendar. That probably doesn't tell you a whole lot. You could take a look at this and say, well, it is the year in which the Eurasian Economic Union will enter into force. And I'm sure as graduate students here, you are familiar with the Eurasian Initiative that President Park Geun-hye has been talking about, President Xi Jinping has been talking about. But this particular thing is different. It connects three Eastern European countries led by Russia, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. Belarus, and it would have three more countries, including, but the grand idea, of course, is to make this into a counterpoint to European Union. And given the geopolitics that are developing, you can see how that is likely to play out. The lettering did not come out very well, but 2015 is also the year when Queen Elizabeth, if she's still reigning in on September 10th, becomes the longest reigning monarch of Britain. She would have completed, I guess, 63 years and 16 days. Quite amazing, isn't it? But if you are like me and had spent a fairish amount of time in European Union with your cell phone, you would be pleased to know that there will be no roaming charges after that date in European Union. If you are, however, a movie buff and have seen Back to the Future series, and in Back to the Future series 2, you will find the young kid, I forget his name now, but putting the date 2015. And of course, they go to 2015 and they discover that there are flying cars and the students would be going on hoverboards and what have you. One more way of looking at that, of course, is that this is when the Combined Forces Command is to be dissolved. And of course, there is now a new lease of life on that, and it's going to continue for a bit longer. But let me bring you back to the subject matter that I wanted to talk to you about. And if you look at that, what you see is the operationalization of the Masdar city. It is just outside Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. And this is a remarkable city. It is the world's first fully sustainable, zero carbon, zero waste city. And the first phase of construction would be completed next year. And Have any of you been to Masdar city already? United Arab Emirates, Dubai, Abu Dhabi? No? Okay, but it's really quite a special city, and the way they have planned things is quite amazing. You could also think about this, if you are concerned about climate change, as the first time that a group of islands in Papua New Guinea become uninhabitable. The water system, the trees and everything would be connected with or contaminated with seawater, and so the Cataract Islands will have to move out. I mean, the islanders will have to move out. And it is, of course, the first time you have a collection of islands. If you take a closer look at the islands, you know, it's a big circle, as you see in that. They will have to move out. I remember in 1994 taking a small boat from Suva, Fiji, to a very small island, and we have noticed even then the effects of land subsidence, sea level rise, whatever you may want to call it, where number of houses, etc., went under. You could also look at that is the year when the solar updraft towers will become operational. And what's interesting about that? Well, it is each tower is about twice the size of the Empire State Building in Manhattan, but each tower would generate about 200 megawatts of energy. It's completely done on the basis of the temperature differential, and will have really profound impact on energy generation and how we're going to do things from then on. I'm coming to the end of my 2015 prominence from an outsider's point of view, and you could also look at this. This is the Large Hadron Collider. How many of you know that? This is about an experiment carried out by CERN, and this area, the circle that you see there, is the circle that goes from Switzerland to France, about 27 kilometers total in the area covered, and it's about 175 meter deep. But what it does is, in 2015, it attains maximum operating power, and when the experiment is completed, they can recreate what it was at the beginning of the universe, in a few seconds after the beginning of, a fraction of a second after the beginning of the universe. So they understand, how the universe is comprised, and what it might mean to us, moving forward, and so on. So those are some of the few items that I picked up to say what 2015 is about. But if you are working for the UN, or interested in what the UN does, and I'm sorry, I'm not really good at doing this PowerPoint thing, and I was doing this over this weekend, so many of the letters escaped. But if you work for the UN, or with the UN, or interested in what the UN does, 2015 is all about the coming to the end of period for the Millennium Development Goals. And the Millennium Development Goals, as you know, I know UNDP is situated right here, and I'm sure of all the various distinguished speakers that came here, you know that it comprises about 8 goals and 21 targets and 60 indicators. So question is, well, what, now that the UN Millennium Development Goals are coming to an end, what is to happen next? You could also think about this as the end of the Hyogo framework for action, 2005 to 2015. So there is HFA 2 is being negotiated as we speak. The co-chair's draft text of the document to be adopted at HFA 2 is being circulated, and that meeting is going to take place during 14th to 18th March 2015 in Sendai. And of course, you all know the significance of Sendai as the venue for hosting this meeting, given what that place had gone through in the tsunami. You could also think about this as a time when sustainable development goals would be adopted. The open working group has been working on this ever since the conclusion of the Rio +20 conference in Rio de Janeiro in 2012, and has recommended 17 goals and 167 targets. And what's different about this and Millennium Development Goals? Well, there are 8 goals and 21 targets and 60 indicators. And this has already 17 goals and 167 targets. They did not come up with indicators, but if you follow the ratio, the indicators are going to be quite a large number. And there is one more complicating or interesting feature about sustainable development goals, that is, Millennium Development Goals are to be implemented in the developing countries, whereas sustainable development goals are global, universal goals. And so we are talking about an exercise unlike anything that United Nations had gone through so far, and it is going to be a very challenging task. It has not been costed out yet, but those that costed it out already said the cost is going to be upwards of $700 billion per annum. And if you think about that, the Millennium Development Goals coming to an end and the post-2015 development agenda comprising both the Sustainable Development Goals and a number of other items, it's going to be really quite substantial. And I don't know how many of you have participated or at least aware of the online survey that was carried about what kind of world do you want to live in. And it is hugely popular. Several millions of people participated in it, particularly young people, and they have come up with what they would like to see in the world, whether it is governance, whether it is human rights, whether it is clean environment, the quality of air, water, and you name it, it's all there. So what kind of future do you want is another big exercise. And the very last thing that I want to share with you about 2015 that concerns my life is, well, that's not the very last thing, the last but one, the climate summit. Now, you are all familiar with the Framework Convention on Climate Change that was adopted in '92 and Kyoto Protocol in '97, and the Copenhagen Summit in 2009, and now we have in 2015 a climate summit. And Secretary General Ban Ki-moon had recently hosted a one-day special summit in New York, where a number of heads of state and government came together and talked about how to add political will and momentum behind the negotiators in terms of moving forward with the subject. And the last thing is, it is also the 70th anniversary of the United Nations. Okay? So 2015 is, of course, many things to many people, but for those of us in the international relations, particularly concerned with the United Nations, 2015 is about the Hyogo framework for action, adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, adoption of the post-2015 development agenda, and the climate summit in 2015. All of them rolled into the idea of celebrating 70th anniversary. And whenever you celebrate a major milestone like that, there is obviously a reflection on what the United Nations is about and what you would like it to be, and so on. So those are some of the things. What I propose to do from now on is to go into the details of some of these topics and share with you my sense of where we are at, and then of course open it up for discussion. And Dean O told me that you're all very active participants in that discussion, so I'm counting on it. So I'm going to go through these. I'm trying to paint on a very large canvas, as you see. Obviously, I cannot go into too much detail into any particular topic, but what I would like you to do is, of course, to save your questions, and then we would have an opportunity to go into some detail as we talk about it. Now, of course, there is some background information that I want to share with you. This is probably familiar stuff, but no harm in having a quick refresher. And in this refresher, what I want to do is to talk to you about the UN itself and talk to you about my office, which is for East and Northeast Asia, located in Incheon. Now, when you think about this, of course, we are talking about 70th anniversary, so it was set up in 1945, and there were 51 original members, but now we have 193 members. There are a number of observer organizations as well as non-governmental organizations with consultative status. It has a staff of about 83,000 people, and within that, there are about 32,400 in the secretariat body. Now, this generally explains to you what you see in the center is the secretariat, that is where I am at, and the middle circle is the program and funds, UNDP, UNEP, and various other things, and the outer circle is specialized agencies, whether it is UNESCO, World Bank, FAO, WHO, all those organizations come there. And this is all familiar to you, so the PPT, of course, is available to you to take a look at it. No, actually what I would suggest is I'm going to clean this up a little bit and then send it back to you again, so you can see all the words that are missing right now, and that way you will have it. So this is a very broad stroke introduction to the UN and what it does, a number of specialized agencies and subsidiary bodies that are there. It is a very complex organization. Any organization that has 83,000 staff members is a complex organization, and this is really no different. The Secretary General Ban Ki-moon was unanimously re-elected for a second term, and he identified 5 priorities, and sustainable development is at the top. Though they are not in any order of importance. He spends just as much time on making sure that the world's women and young people are given the due attention that is needed. And when we do our recruitment, it is very important for us in all our human resources action plan that we demonstrate what we are doing to attract women to join the United Nations, not only in terms of joining at basic junior levels, but also making sure at the top levels there is equal representation. And Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has done more about that than anybody else in making sure that women are in the in his senior management group. And of course, the safer and more secure world, which is of course the main reason why the United Nations was set up, is after the Second World War, to make sure that there is no Third World War. And the importance of prevention, a stitch in time, as they say, saves 9, and helping countries in transition. There are still many countries in transition, whether you call them developing countries, landlocked countries, small island developing states, etc. So those are the things. But of course, money is always limited, and so the Secretary General's approach is to do more with less and do more with partnerships. And so those are some of the key elements in that. I'm not going to go into the detail of this. What you see on the left-hand side are the major areas of work. We do all of them, but what we are oftentimes known most is for what you see on the right-hand side, which is peacekeeping operations in 16 countries and 4 continents, and humanitarian aid. So those are the things that you oftentimes see United Nations most identified with, but the norm creation, settlement of disputes, and various other things that we do on environment, technology and information, culture, etc., are also core functions of the United Nations. If you look at the basic core budget of the United Nations, about 80% of it is spent on economic and social affairs, something that was not the original intention of the establishment of the United Nations. So just to put that into words, it is about assessing situations and developing norms, formulating recommendations, providing platforms for multilateral dialogue and cooperation, and mobilizing and supporting actions. Now, a brief introduction about my office. My office is a sub-regional office of the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. And this office has been set up it was the earliest commission set up by the United Nations in 1947. And it was founded in Shanghai, China, but in 1949 moved to Bangkok. And in 1974 changed its name from ECAFE, Economic Commission for Asia and the Far East, to Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. And I would like you to pay particular attention to the founding members of ESCAP: Australia, China, not the China that we see now. I mean, it's the Republic of China, not the PRC. France, India, which just gained independence, Netherlands, Philippines, also in a transition but became independent then, Soviet Union, Thailand. So when you look at it, the key so-called Asian countries that you see there are India, Philippines, and Thailand. All the rest are from other parts. But now we have 62 member countries, and all the process of decolonization brought many of these countries independence, and then they wanted to become members of ESCAP in their own right, and they have done that. So now going into my office, the 62 countries that ESCAP has as its members and associate members are from, if you look at the map, they go all the way from Turkey and Iran on one side, Australia, New Zealand, and all the Pacific Islands on the other, to Russia on this side. So it's really a very large part of the world, and the United Nations General Assembly came to the conclusion that we should do more in terms of reaching out to the member countries, and so the creation of the sub-regional offices came, and one sub-region identified is Eastern Northeast Asia, and it is inaugurated on 17th May 2010, and we have 6 countries: China, Mongolia, Russia, Japan, South Korea, North Korea, and 2 associate members, Hong Kong and Macau. These are our various sub-regional offices. What you see with the ESCAP, this is the headquarters in Thailand, and New Delhi, Almaty, Incheon, and Suva in the Pacific Islands. So the idea is to be close to the member countries and work with them on that. Northeast Asia, you're all graduate students, of course you realize the importance of it. It contributes about 70% of the GDP in Asia Pacific. There are only 6 countries, but its footprint is about 70% in terms of the GDP. And if you talk about climate impacts, Northeast Asia accounts for about 60% of carbon emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, and you have a thing here showing where each of these countries come on a global scale. Population, yes, Northeast Asia is about 40%, and if you take ESCAP, it is about 2/3 of the world's population. Again, it's very big footprint. If you take aging as a problem, this part of the world is more profound and more pronounced than any other part. 60% of the aged population is in Northeast Asia, and so there are a number of things that my office does on all the topics that I just mentioned to you, including trade and transport facilitation, and working with the aged, and also with youth, environment issues, and so on. But the interesting part is, despite the fact that we are very large in terms of its footprint in Asia Pacific, when you look at this as the South Asia, and look at this as Southeast Asia, and this is the Pacific, and out here is you have the Central Asia. In each of those places you have formal structures to bring those countries together. But when you think about this part, there is no multilateral mechanism other than my office. My office deals with it in 2 ways. One is through the Eastern Northeast Asia, and another is, so the program areas that we deal with there are environment, disaster resilience, partnerships of various kinds, connectivity and social disparities. These are the things I've just mentioned to you about. But each and every one of them is really quite important. Important because of the political tensions that exist amongst the member countries here, and important because of the large footprint that this region casts, not only in terms of Asia Pacific, but globally. In fact, when the world economy was having a massive crisis recently, it is the growth pillars, growth poles are in Asia Pacific, and particularly this region had a profound impact on that. My office also acts as the Secretariat for Northeast Asian Sub-Regional Program for Environmental Cooperation. This is a separate and independent intergovernmental mechanism. It's not the UN body, but they have asked UN to provide them with the Secretariat, and our commission passed a resolution asking my office to provide the Secretariat. And so this deals with dust and sandstorm, urbanization and environment, biodiversity, whether it is Amur tigers and snow leopards, air pollution. Of course, we see a lot of things being talked about from China, and marine environment. Again, given the political differences amongst the 6 sub-regional countries, this is also a profoundly important matter. The one thing that I want to share with you is, even at the height of political differences amongst the member countries, when we have meetings of NEASPEC, we always had all 6 countries participating. North Koreans talking to Japanese, or South Koreans, and Japanese talking to Chinese, and then coming to some common understanding on how to move forward. So it's really quite exciting to be dealing with those issues in the middle of the kind of political controversy that you see there. Now I want to go into, so what I have done so far is to talk to you about 2015 and what it means if you are working with UN, for UN, or interested in what the UN does. And then I have given you a little bit of a sweeping overview of what the UN does and what UNESCAP does, and particularly what my office does. Okay? Now we're going into 3 topics in particular: the Millennium Development Goals, the Open Working Group and Post-2015 Development Agenda, Climate Summit, and then I will stop, and then we will have a discussion on all these topics. Now, you are familiar with Millennium Development Goals. These were adopted or extracted from the Millennium Declaration that the heads of state and government adopted in the year 2000. But the Millennium Development Goals were extracted by the Secretariat. They were not negotiated by the member countries. They were put together by the Secretariat, both in terms of what the goals might be, and in doing that, they used their judgment. They did not take everything that is in the Millennium Declaration and put it into the goals. They tried to take few goals that are very particular, that deal with what they think are pressing problems and how to move forward with them, and in developing targets and indicators. Again, this is an exercise carried out by experts sitting around a table, figuring out what needs to be done and how. As I mentioned to you, there are 8 goals and 21 targets and about 60 indicators. What we have discovered is that amongst the 8, goals 7 and 8 did not produce a lot of results that we are happy about: the environmental sustainability and global partnerships for development. But the global partnerships for development is taken up in other fora: Paris, Accra, Busan, aid effectiveness meetings, and OECD and G20 and others are all looking into that. And the Rio +20 said, well, environmental sustainability is very important. We have not made progress, so we should think about whatever agenda that we adopt post MDGs should include that in a more explicit manner. But on the 6 that are there, we made a lot of very good progress, and the question therefore is, what is left to be accomplished in the MDGs, and what more did the world community want out of the Rio +20, and how do you package these things together? So this particular slide is interesting because, as I said, the Millennium Declaration produced the Millennium Development Goals. The Rio +20 and the green economy, and the green economy in the context of the sub-region that I work in, is quite interesting because every country, barring North Korea that did not come out and say anything about this, had an element of the green economy. Japanese talk about low carbon growth, Koreans talk about green growth, China about eco-civilization, circular economy, and Mongolia about green development plan. They passed a law about that, and Russia likewise is talking about green economy. So out of that, the goals, sustainable development goals. But the unfinished MDGs are put into the sustainable development goals as well, and the resource crisis and the climate change, there are aspects of it that are brought in here, and there are a number of other common challenges, whether it is governance, rule of law, human rights, are also brought into this. Now, the interesting part here is there are a lot of people that would like to see, I mean, this is brand new in the sense that the United Nations did not try to deal with this in a very systematic manner. They have articulated what could be done and made the links between environmental sustainability, green jobs, and energy connectivity, and all those things into this green economy bit. But so it's fairly new in terms of the link between this and this. But when you think about this and this, there are many people that say that we made a lot of progress on implementing Millennium Development Goals, although it was not a negotiated process. In contrast, on climate, though it is a negotiated process, we did not make a lot of progress. And therefore, they say that, well, maybe this would be a ticket out in terms of making progress. And the common challenges, of course, are there, and we need to do something about it. And this is the process for post-2015 development agenda, and I showed you in one of the earlier slides about the sustainable development goals, what looked like a Christmas tree. And the reason I picked that particular slide as opposed to any of the others that are there is it was treated as a Christmas tree. When you have broad-based consultations, the civil society organizations and all the experts from the academic community coming together under the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and all the private sector coming under the Global Compact, it has become an exercise of managing expectations. You do not want to, when a lot of people say that this is of importance to me, you do not want to say that no, it is not important, because who are you to judge in terms of what is important and what's not important. And so it has become really an unmanageable process. And then you have the intergovernmental process. This is largely of the United Nations and various bodies associated with it in terms of what needs to be done. There is an open working group I mentioned to you, and there is an intergovernmental committee of experts on sustainable development financing, and the UNDG has 11 thematic areas, and they carried out national regional consultations, and we in the regional commissions carried out regional consultations. You really have to think about this a little bit just to understand the magnitude of the consultative process that the United Nations had gone through. And I don't know how often do you as this group sit together to decide on anything. If you were to do that, you would understand how complex and difficult that process can be. And now multiply that thousands of times, then you get a sense of what it is. And then the Secretary General himself did not want to be just waiting for these two processes to produce results so he can decide what he needs to do. So he created his own task team on post-2015 development agenda. He established a high-level panel of eminent persons, including the former foreign minister of Korea and a number of other people, and he produced a report, A Life of Dignity for All, and I highly recommend it because those, so in other words, what we have is we have multiple processes producing multiple sets of recommendations, and the challenge ultimately, of course, the decisions will have to be taken by the United Nations, and the challenge for the United Nations and the member countries represented in that is to sift through all this and then figure out what needs to be done and moving forward, with that. I'm not going to spend any time on this. There are a total of 13 sessions, but this is the part that you want to think about. These are all the various topics, but by no means this is an exhaustive list, mind you. Okay, this is already a list that included, that sort of merged various interests into that. And these are 17 SDGs, and I've listed all 17 of them. But the most important, I mean, everything is important, of course, but the most important one is the 17, strengthen the means of implementation and the global partnership for sustainable development. Because ultimately, the 16 that are there out there, they could be handled at the national level, because for any good governance, for any government that is in power, the job is defining and defending public interest. They need to figure out what makes sense, how do we meet the goals and aspirations of the people, making sure that they have enough to eat, education, decent quality of life. But when you come to 17, this is where the UN and the intergovernmental organizations and regional agencies, etc., become very prominent, because this is where the outside help can be given. And again, as I said, 17 may be too many, but this is a process. Ultimately, the member countries decide, and I hope that in deciding, they would try to either reduce them further and make it, you shouldn't aim for exhaustiveness. One of the problems, now I'm not speaking as a UN official, I'm speaking more as a concerned individual and somebody who has taught these subjects in law schools for many years. When you front load the agenda with too much, no matter how much success you have at the end of the day, it would be considered a failure, because there are a lot of things that you don't manage to finish up. There are a lot of things where you don't make progress, and that is a mistake, because in the end what you say is that, well, okay, you may have succeeded in 2, 3, and 5, and 7, and 10, but what about the rest of them? So if we want, the one thing that you do not want when you are leading a process like this is to lose the expectations that the people have placed in you. Okay, and so from that point of view also, it's important to keep this list a little bit more manageable. And if we succeed and manage to bring them down to a meaningful level, these might be the ones that I would pick. Again, I'm not going to read them to you, but you will have the PowerPoint so you can read through them yourself. But by 2030, these are some of the achievable goals that we want to have. But to be able to do that, we have to implement the fully the ODA commitments. Now, the reason I put this in is ODA commitments is a very important political argument for the many countries that are participating in the United Nations process. Although the ODA, what it was in the 60s and what it is in 2010, in the 60s, it's about, say, 70% of capital movement to developing countries is through ODA. In 2010, it's only about 13%. But where is the rest of the money coming from? It's coming from the foreign direct investment, the private sector engagement. Now, when you think about the private sector engagement, it's very important to keep in mind that the total money in terms of the GDP that you see in the world, this is not an accurate figure, but I'm rounding it off, it's about $90 trillion. Out of that, the private sector's role is about $60 trillion. So you can figure that out for yourself in terms of the impact and influence that the private sector has. So, to constantly harping on the ODA is the only means of financial flows would be mistaking the bigger action where it is. And of course, many of the things that we're talking about, whether it is Green Climate Fund or even in terms of the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, etc., will have to come from the private sector, and we will talk more about that. Now, this is, I'm sorry about this, you can't see at all, but what I wanted to do is talk about the Hyogo framework for action, and with particular focus on Asia Pacific. Asia Pacific, we have had some of the most devastating earthquakes, storms, floods, typhoons, ranging from Philippines to Thailand to Japan to Manila to Philippines. This is really quite devastating for Asia Pacific. And why is it devastating? Well, it is because we are most disaster prone region in the world, and when you look at the comparisons, whether it is in terms of the people affected or in terms of the economy affected, it is really quite devastating. And then when we think about the Hyogo framework for action, the one adopted in 2005, it talked about making progress. It had 5 priority areas, and those priority areas talk about risk identification, assessment, monitoring, and early warning. But the one thing that they did not have is a baseline against which to measure the progress made in the implementation of those various recommendations. And so you can't tell whether the HFA made the difference in terms of reducing anything. So the challenges in terms of the disaster framework that we have is we need some data, a baseline. And so what we are trying to do in UNESCAP through our resolution passed just very recently is to collect the disaster related statistics. Idea is to have improve coherence, comparability, and interoperability of disaster statistics. Now, this subregion is one of the best subregions in terms of collecting data, disaster data. I mean, any kind of data. China, Japan, and Korea have excellent mechanisms to collect data. But the numbers that they use, the tools that they use, make it almost impossible to make comparisons, from one country to another country. And likewise, when you think about ASEAN countries, you have multiple languages and different ways of measuring this. And but our key point is integrating this into the disaster risk management to post-2015 SDG monitoring, because there is, you all heard about this big data revolution, starting with the World Bank president to the United Nations Secretary General to everybody is talking about it. So that is absolutely vital to know what's happening, who is affected by what, and how to give support and succor as needed. When we move to the 2, as I mentioned, it's taking place 14th to 18th in March in Sendai. So they have now the numbers very clearly laid out. Reduced disaster mortality by and a date. Number of affected people by and a date. So these are the things that would help us in understanding what kind of progress we are making and how to do that. Now, I want to move to climate change. I was, as the Dean O kindly mentioned, one of the lead authors of the IPCC 5th assessment, which just came out. And I was part of this 3rd working group. And I wanted to just give you a sense of how these assessments are prepared. There is, it's a very detailed, complex, complicated process. And there is oftentimes an impression in the media, particularly by those that don't understand the process or by those that want to discredit the findings of the IPCC, that it is a small cabal. They meet in some dark room and then decide what kind of message they want to give to the world. But I wanted to just share with you that when you see this, it's not only this many pages, but there are about 38,000 comments. You can go anytime and look at not only where those comments came from, but more importantly, how we responded to those comments. It is all public record. And so you can figure out from your own perspective whether we did a good job or not. What are the key messages? Well, the key messages are climate change is a global problem, global commons problem. And the way to reflect that is that it is an envelope within which we are going to solve all other problems. In other words, you don't get the climate change solutions right, you are not going to get the solutions on anything else. One classic example is this. Climate change impacts talk about increased occurrences of storm surges and consequently sea level rise and land subsidence and so on. And if you don't get this right and manage to keep the occurrences of those low, the development gains that you make through Millennium Development Goals is going to be set back. And so, it's important to keep that in mind. And the other points that I mentioned here, it talks about the key messages coming out of this IPCC fifth assessment. Now, if I could go to this will tell you more graphically what has happened between 1750 to 1970. The total amount of carbon dioxide emissions we put into the atmosphere are about 900 billion tons, or gigatons as a scientist would like to call them. But between 1970 to 2010, we have added in 40 years 1100 billion tons, and that is the problem. With industrial revolution and the continued activity of economic development, and of course this picture tells you where it is coming from, the various kinds of additions that you see there. The question simply is, when you think about the open working group findings of Sustainable Development Goals, I mentioned to you that the 16 goals could pretty much be dealt with at the national level. But when it talks about climate change, it is a global commons problem, and it requires international cooperation across scales. So if this is the UNFCCC and this is intergovernmental and national, regional and subnational, it goes into various things. And one good example I can give you of that is when we had Secretary General, in his various high-level policy bodies that he creates, he generally brings former heads of state and government or sitting ministers, but mostly government representatives. He has of late been reaching out to mayors. He named Mike Bloomberg as his climate, special envoy, and reaching out to private sector as well as to academic community. Again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend any time in this, but you will have an opportunity to review this at your leisure. But these are things that talk about what works. Is it a command and control system, a global set of goals that are enshrined in an agreement, or do you give some kind of a free market? Just tell them you have to reduce emissions by such and such, but leave the way of doing that to themselves. The negotiations have shown us the kind of ambivalence that the member countries go through. When you talk about the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, it talks about percentage emission reductions from various countries. But now they talk about some kind of pledge and review or national announcements of various things. And of course, all of this is implicitly relying on the kind of financing that is available through Green Climate Fund or otherwise to move forward in the right way. And the Green Climate Fund, if it succeeds, the Green Climate Fund, by the way, is located in the same building as my office in Songdo. It is to produce $100 billion for disbursements by 2020. It's a tall order, but the United Nations is committed to making sure that that happens, and many of the things that the Secretary General is doing are in that realm. We need transformation. We cannot make incremental changes to what we are doing and hope that this is going to produce the results that we need. And oftentimes people don't understand what the incremental change versus transformational changes. An incremental change is just to give you one very immediately comprehensible example, is taking a car that produces about 25 miles per gallon and making it to 50 miles per gallon. Okay? It increases efficiency and reduces releases into the atmosphere of greenhouse gases. A transformational change is taking an internal combustion engine and making it redundant, making it completely electric. So that kind of a thing is needed, and the world is thinking about that a great deal. So we need financial resources and using them in the most efficient ways, and we need to deal with socio-economic challenges at the same time. And developing new policies and technologies in a timely manner is an extremely important part of that as well. Now, I'm coming to the conclusion of my presentation, and then we will have an opportunity to talk. The Secretary General Summit, the climate summit that I talked to you about, was a success. It was a success because it generated some money for the process, generated political commitment, and my sense is that the Paris summit in 2015 in December will also be a high watermark. But high watermark, I don't mean necessarily that we will have a binding legal instrument that would bind all the member countries the same way, but it would produce a new set of policies and measures, etc. The main question that you will have to think about, and I would encourage you to think about, is in terms of international action, what is the best way of moving forward? Is it through a protocol, convention protocol type approach, or is it through voluntary commitments that are made voluntarily, but once you make them become binding, or is it voluntary commitments, or is it in terms of completely at the national level or subnational level, moving upwards? These are important questions, and I hope we will have a chance to look at that. The other thing that you want to think about is, we're talking about the Hyogo framework for action, sustainable development goals, and climate. Now, we shouldn't be thinking about these as independent and separate processes, because if you do that, then you're of course multiplying the institutional architecture, trying to spend limited amount of money in a very dissipated manner. So things that are there in the Hyogo framework for action, that are there in the open working group results in the sustainable development goals, that will also be in the climate. You need to see the match and make sure that one is talking to the other. And what I tried to do in this slide is really to take those that are in the sustainable development goals and talk about their connection to climate change impacts, both in terms of adaptation and mitigation. This is all about finance, and they are directly related to goal 17, which is about means of implementation. I talked to you about that already. And the traditional ones are finance, technology, and capacity building. But the new one that is added is trade, because the trade is going to bring about the kind of benefits that would help all these member countries. But to be able to make progress on that, we need policy and institutional coherence and partnership, multi-stakeholder partnership. It is not just a donor and donee relationship, but it is about various actors, including the private sector. I've already given you a sense of the large impact they have in the global scale, and so you need to obviously use them. And data monitoring and accountability is absolutely vital. One of the things that many people are critical about HFA1 is that there is no baseline. If you don't have a baseline, you cannot say whether you made progress or not. Likewise, if you don't have monitoring and accountability frameworks, you cannot tell whether you made any difference in what you're trying to do. So this is probably the last slide. So the question is, what should 2015 mean to you? Okay. The few slides that I showed to you was more for fun and to get you started thinking about 2015. But if you're thinking about the UN and the UN related activities, my sincerest submission to you is 2015 is not an inflection point. It is not a point on a curve. It is profound and momentous. And I say this with all the conviction I can bring to the table. There are challenges that are coming at us fast and furious. I'm not just talking about what challenges we see today, you know, whether it is in terms of crisis in the Middle East or Ebola or you know, various other crises that that the world community deals with on a regular basis, but not dealing with HFA, not dealing with putting in place a structure that would get us to the post-2015 development agenda, and not having a climate regime that is going to tell member countries how to move forward right way, are extraordinarily, profoundly important matters. And if we don't get that right, you know, we will have, we will regret it, to put it very mildly. The question oftentimes is, well, the challenges that you identify are so formidable, and we don't have any evidence that we can get our act together. So what makes you hopeful that we can get our act together in time to make the course correction necessary? Well, nothing gets the attention focused like being caught in a crisis, and we have some major crises in recent times. And I think when the member countries, particularly presidents and the prime ministers, come together and then talk about these issues and are saying that this is an important topic, then I would like to think that they are going to do something about it. So the course correction is needed, and course correction can be made, but the time to make it, of course, is in this magical year 2015. This slide is to, you know, we were trying to decide, you know, one of the things that I've discovered in Korea is that you go to any place and you get a small gift of some kind or the other. So we said, well, we have to have a gift from our office. And so what we tried to do is have our staff talk about all the various issues that our office deals with, and these are the issues. So what we did was we put this on a tea mug, a coffee mug, or whatever you want to call it. And so just to give you a sense of ultimately, you know, coming back to my office, what are the things that we work on? These are the things. That, ladies and gentlemen, concludes my talk. I'm sorry it was long and hopefully detailed, and gave you some thing to think about, but now I'm ready to answer any questions that you may have. Dean O and ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure being here with you, and thank you for all your attention.